There is a pattern in history that has destroyed the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. In 476 AD, Rome didn't fall because of a single invading army. It collapsed after decades of currency debasement, elite corruption, and institutional rot hollowed it out from the inside. In 1596, Spain ruled an empire where the sun never set, importing 80% of its goods while drowning in silver-fueled debt, then defaulting on its obligations for the sixth time. In December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved without a major battlefield defeat, after its economy stopped producing, its institutions stopped functioning, and its people stopped believing. Different centuries, different continents, same outcome. And right now, in 2025, the United States and the Western-led global order are following the exact same pattern. And here's what should terrify you. Every empire I thought collapse would come from outside, none of them saw the internal decay in time. This is the story of how internal decay destroyed empires faster than wars. Before we go through this pattern, you need to understand what internal decay actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. It isn't about a single bad leader or one failed policy. It's about systems quietly breaking while the surface still looks stable. Roads still function, markets still trade, armies still march. But underneath, the incentives rot, the institutions hollow out, and the numbers stop adding up. This isn't just about economics, it's about legitimacy. When people no longer believe the system works for them, productivity falls. When productivity falls, debt rises. When debt rises, currency is manipulated to hide the damage. And when currency loses credibility, everything built on top of it begins to fracture. At first, decay looks manageable. Growth slows, but officials say it's temporary. Costs rise, but they blame external shocks. Trust erodes, but it's dismissed as polarization. But then something changes. The system starts consuming more than it produces. Maintenance is deferred. Promises outpace resources. And every solution creates a bigger problem downstream. It's not sudden collapse. That's the myth. The reality is accumulation. Small decisions compounding over decades until the structure can no longer support its own weight. That's not theoretical. That's documented history. Rome, Spain, the Soviet Union. Each followed the same sequence. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed they could manage the trade-offs indefinitely. They couldn't. Let me show you how this happened 3 times before and why it's happening again. Let's start with the Roman Empire. By the year 117 AD, Rome stood at its absolute peak. Under Emperor Trajan, it controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers, governed an estimated 65 million people, and commanded the most sophisticated military machine on Earth. Roman roads stretched over 400,000 kilometers. Its silver denarius was trusted from Britain to Egypt. Rome looked invincible. But the collapse didn't begin with barbarians at the gates. It began with internal strain. By 180 AD, after the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome faced a problem it could not solve. The empire was no longer expanding, but its costs kept rising. Legions still needed to be paid. Bureaucracies still grew. Urban populations still depended on state grain distributions. Without new conquests, there was no new inflow of gold, silver, or slaves. The system stopped growing, but the obligations didn't. So Rome made a decision. It debased its currency. In 211 AD, Emperor Caracalla reduced the silver content of the denarius from roughly 50% to about 40%. By 250 AD, under Emperor Decius, it fell below 30%. By 270 AD, during the reign of Aurelian, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. Same coin, same face, less value. The effect was immediate. Prices rose. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Taxes increased to compensate. Farmers abandoned their land because taxes exceeded output. Trade contracted because no one trusted the money. What had been a monetary fix became a structural failure. But Rome didn't stop there. To control inflation, Emperor Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. It fixed wages and prices across the empire. Violations were punishable by death. The intent was stability. The result was collapse. Goods disappeared from markets. Trade went underground. Production declined further. The state tried to control outcomes without fixing causes. Just like that, the private economy began to die. At the same time, Rome's political institutions were eroding. Between 235 AD and 284 AD, Rome went through 26 emperors in just 49 years. Most were assassinated. Some ruled for months. None could plan long-term. Power shifted from the Senate to the military, from law to force. Loyalty was bought, not earned. And here's where the pattern deepens. To pay the army, taxes were raised again. By the late 3rd century, peasants were legally bound to the land to prevent them from fleeing taxation. Occupations became hereditary. Social mobility vanished. The Roman economy, once dynamic and innovative, froze into place. Maintenance stopped. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Roads cracked. Cities shrank. By 400 AD, the city of Rome had lost more than half its population. Not from invasion, from decay. The army itself weakened. By 300 AD, Rome increasingly relied on mercenaries and foederati, foreign troops paid with land instead of wages. Loyalty shifted away from Rome as an idea toward local commanders. The empire could still fight, but it could no longer sustain itself. Then came the shocks. In 376 AD, the Goths crossed the Danube, fleeing the Huns. Rome couldn't integrate them or repel them effectively. In 410 AD, Rome was sacked by Alaric. In 455 AD, it was sacked again by the Vandals. But by then, the damage was already done. These weren't causes, they were symptoms. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But the real collapse took over 200 years, a slow hollowing, a system that consumed more than it produced, a currency no one trusted, institutions that no longer functioned. That's what internal decay looks like. Not dramatic defeat, administrative exhaustion. Rome didn't fall because it was conquered. It fell because it could no longer pay, maintain, or believe in itself. And this is just the first time the pattern appears. Let's jump forward more than 1,000 years. The Spanish Empire. In 1580, Spain was the richest and most powerful empire on earth. Under King Philip II, it controlled territories across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Between 1500 and 1650, more than 180 tons of gold and over 16,000 tons of silver flowed into Spain from the New World. On paper, Spain should have been unstoppable. But, just like Rome, the collapse didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in the ledger. By 1550, Spain had a problem that looked suspiciously familiar. The empire was consuming far more than it produced. Instead of building domestic industry, Spain imported almost everything. By the late 16th century, roughly 80% of manufactured goods consumed in Spain came from abroad. Spanish silver paid for Dutch textiles, Italian arms, and German tools. The empire extracted wealth but failed to create a productive base. At first, the silver hid everything. Inflation surged. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Spain rose by roughly 400%. Wages didn't keep up, productivity fell. But the crown kept spending. Wars in the Netherlands, naval expansion against England, endless military commitments across Europe. To cover the gap, Spain borrowed. By 1557, King Philip II defaulted on Spain's debt for the first time. Then again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596, 6 sovereign defaults in total. Each time creditors were promised reform. Each time, silver shipments resumed. Each time nothing structural changed. Just like Rome, Spain treated symptoms instead of causes. And here's where the pattern becomes unmistakable. As inflation destroyed purchasing power, Spain raised taxes. By 1600, Castile was among the most heavily taxed regions in Europe. Productive citizens fled. Farmers abandoned land. Entrepreneurs moved capital abroad. The economy hollowed out further. Sound familiar? The crown also debased its currency. In 1599, Spain introduced copper-based vellon coins to supplement silver shortages. By 1628, vellon dominated circulation. Prices spiked again. Trust collapsed. Merchants demanded payment in foreign coin. Trade slowed. The state had effectively sabotaged its own monetary system. Meanwhile, institutions decayed. Positions in government were sold. Tax collection was outsourced to private interests. Corruption became systemic. Decisions were made to preserve elite privilege, not national resilience. Spain looked powerful, but underneath, it was brittle. Just like Rome, Spain tried control. Price controls were imposed. Grain markets were regulated. Exports were restricted. The result was scarcity. Food shortages, black markets, declining output. Every intervention reduced long-term capacity. By the early 1600s, the consequences were visible. Population declined. Urban centers shrank. Infrastructure deteriorated. Spain still had an empire, but it no longer had an economy. And then came the shocks. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was defeated by England. In the Netherlands, rebellion dragged on for decades. In 1640, Portugal broke away. Catalonia revolted. Spain's military failures weren't the cause of decline. They were the exposure of it. By 1700, when the last Habsburg king of Spain died, the empire was a shell. Its silver had financed everyone except itself. Its debts strangled policy. Its institutions were exhausted. What remained was ceremonial power without substance. Just like Rome, different century, different continent, identical collapse. Spain didn't fall because it lost a single war. It fell because internal decay made victory impossible. The pattern had played out again. Now, let's look at the most recent example, one you probably remember, the Soviet Union. In 1945, the USSR emerged from World War II as a superpower. By 1950, it controlled Eastern Europe, commanded the largest standing army on the planet, and governed roughly 290 million people. It put the first satellite into space in 1957, the first human into orbit in 1961. On the surface, it looked like a system that could last forever. But here's what should really concern you. The Soviet collapse didn't take centuries like Rome. It didn't take generations like Spain. It happened with terrifying speed. The decay began quietly in the 1960s. By 1965, Soviet economic growth was already slowing. Central planning had delivered rapid industrialization, but it couldn't deliver efficiency. Factories met quotas, not demand. Output was measured in tonnage, not usefulness. Warehouses filled with unusable goods while shelves stayed empty. Productivity stagnated. The state responded the same way every decaying system does. It spent more. By 1980, the Soviet Union devoted between 15 and 17% of its GDP to the military. The United States spent about 5%. The burden was crushing. Resources were diverted from housing, infrastructure, and consumer goods into weapon systems that produced no economic return, just like Rome, just like Spain. To hide the damage, the USSR borrowed. By the early 1980s, Soviet foreign debt exceeded $30 billion. That doesn't sound catastrophic until you understand the system produced almost no hard currency. Oil exports kept it alive. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, revenues fell by nearly 50% in 2 years. This is where acceleration begins. By 1987, shortages were everywhere. Meat, fuel, medicine, trust evaporated. People stopped believing official statistics because they contradicted lived reality. Productivity collapsed further because effort no longer mattered. Institutions cracked. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev attempted reform, perestroika, glasnost. But reforms introduced transparency without fixing incentives. Corruption was exposed, not eliminated. Regional elites saw weakness and prepared exits. The same trap that destroyed Spain was closing again. Reform arrived too late. Then came the cascade. In 1989, Eastern Europe broke free. In August 1991, a failed coup shattered central authority. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. No invasion, no decisive war, just administrative failure, from superpower to non-existence in 6 years. Compare the timelines. Rome took roughly 200 years to collapse. Spain took about 150. The Soviet Union took less than a decade once the system cracked. The pattern wasn't just repeating, it was accelerating. 3 times, 3 empires, 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same sequence. And now comes the part you won't like. And here's what should terrify you. The United States and the Western-led global economic order are following the exact same pattern. Stage by stage, stage 1 is overextension. The United States maintains roughly 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. Annual defense spending exceeded $886 billion in 2024. That is more than the next 10 countries combined. Just like Rome guarding distant frontiers, just like Spain fighting endless European wars, just like the Soviet Union pouring resources into military prestige. The cost isn't just money, it's opportunity. Capital, labor, and political attention diverted away from domestic renewal. Check. Stage 2 is declining productive capacity. In 1950, the United States accounted for nearly 40% of global manufacturing output. By 2024, that number had fallen below 16%. Entire supply chains moved offshore. Critical industries hollowed out. The economy became dependent on imports financed by debt. Spain imported goods paid for with silver. Rome imported grain paid for with debased coin. The structure is the same. Check. Stage 3 is debt replacing growth. In 1980, total U.S. federal debt stood at roughly $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2010, $13.5 trillion. By 2025, over $36 trillion. Debt isn't being used to build productive capacity. It's being used to sustain consumption and fund existing obligations. Interest alone exceeded $1 trillion annually by 2024. That's more than the defense budget. Just like Spain borrowing against future silver. Just like Rome taxing tomorrow to survive today. Check. Stage 4 is currency manipulation to mask the damage. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. Money creation replaced structural reform. Inflation followed. Between 2020 and 2023, consumer prices rose by more than 20%. Official numbers softened the reality, but households felt it immediately. Same coin, same face, less value. Check. Stage 5 is institutional decay. Trust in government collapsed. According to Gallup, confidence in Congress fell below 15% by 2023. Trust in media, courts, and financial institutions followed. Decision-making became reactive, not strategic. Short-term political survival replaced long-term planning. Rome cycled emperors. Spain sold offices. The Soviet Union issued statistics no one believed. The pattern doesn't care about ideology. Check. Stage 6 is social fracture. When systems stop delivering upward mobility, societies polarize. Labor participation declined. Real wages stagnated. By 2024, over 60% of Americans lived paycheck to paycheck. Wealth concentrated upward. The top 1% controlled more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Elites insulated themselves while the base absorbed inflation. That exact dynamic preceded collapse every time. Check. Stage 7 is external confidence erosion. Reserve currency status depends on trust. In 2000, the US dollar made up over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, it had fallen closer to 58%. Alternatives emerged. Bilateral trade agreements bypassed the dollar. BRICS expanded. Gold purchases by central banks hit record highs in 2023 and 2024. Rome lost faith in its coinage. Spain lost faith in its silver. The USSR lost faith in the ruble. This stage always comes late. Check. Here's the critical detail. We're not approaching the pattern, we're deep inside it. The same cause and effect chain is visible. Overextension leads to debt. Debt leads to monetary distortion. Monetary distortion leads to inflation. Inflation erodes trust. Trust erosion fractures society. Fracture paralyzes institutions. Paralysis makes reform impossible. And just like before, leaders insist this time is different. They say the dollar is too dominant. They say technology will save productivity. They say debt doesn't matter because it's owed in our own currency. Every empire said the same thing in its own language. Rome believed it was eternal. Spain believed silver was infinite. The Soviet Union believed ideology could override economics. They were wrong, every single time. So where are we in the sequence? Late stage? Very late stage. If the pattern holds, the next phase is acceleration. Not gradual decline, but cascading failure. Budget crises, currency shocks, institutional legitimacy breaking all at once. When confidence goes, it goes fast. Maybe it takes 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. And this affects you directly. Your currency, your savings, your job stability, your cost of living. When internal decay reaches its final stages, ordinary people pay first. Through inflation, through austerity, through lost opportunity. History doesn't repeat because people are stupid. It repeats because incentives don't change. The pattern says, what comes next? 3 times this happened. Rome, Spain, the Soviet Union. Each one believed they were exceptional. Each believed their scale, their power, their system made them immune. Each believed the rules of history no longer applied. They were wrong. Every single time. The pattern was identical. Internal decay came first. Debt replaced growth. Currency was distorted to hide the damage. Institutions lost credibility. Elites insulated themselves. Society fractured. And only at the very end did the world notice the collapse. We're telling ourselves the same stories right now. That debt doesn't matter. That printing money has no cost. That technology will outrun fundamentals. That reserve currency status is permanent. That polarization is normal and manageable. But the pattern doesn't care about stories. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot consume more than you produce forever. You cannot borrow without limit. You cannot debase currency without consequences. And you cannot hollow out institutions and expect stability at the end. Every empire learns the same lesson. Every empire learns it too late. Every empire believes it will be the exception. Since 2020, every stage has accelerated. Debt accumulation sped up. Monetary expansion intensified. Trust collapsed faster. Political paralysis deepened. The timeline compressed, just like it did with the Soviet Union. What once took centuries now takes decades, sometimes years. Maybe there's a way out. Maybe reform comes in time. Maybe the system does what others couldn't. Maybe. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. And history says that when internal decay reaches this stage, events move faster than anyone expects. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as normalcy, as markets still trading, as institutions still operating, as leaders still giving speeches, until one day they don't. If this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the sequence, stay with this channel. Because when the next stages arrive, understanding how and why matters more than ever. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, in the ruins of Rome, in the ledgers of Spain, in the archives of the Soviet Union, and history is about to collect its debt again.